Hi. Hello, Asha. Thanks for agreeing to speak to me about your book, Anna Mani, The Uncut Diamond, which was published just a few months back by the National Book Trust, India.
Thanks, Nandita. Lovely to speak to you.
So, I'm just going to do a quick introduction of you to our listeners who maybe have not heard of you before. Asha Gopinathan is a researcher and a writer based in Thiruvananthapuram. And she has worked for many years in experimental as well as computational neuroscience, both in India and in the US. And alongside, she's been pursuing her interests in gender and in STEM and also in the history of science. This is her latest book. Now, as a journalist and a writer who's been interested in women in science in India, I'm grateful for this very thoroughly researched biography of Anna Mani, who, for those of you who may not know, was one of the most important meteorologists of the 20th century. And she was quite well known among the highest echelons of Indian science in her time. And yet, somehow, her name and her contributions have slipped through the cracks of time. And this is something we will be addressing over the course of this interview. But first, Asha, I wanted to ask you about your introduction to Anna Mani and what made you decide to write this book.
Well, I have never heard of Anna Mani actually, till Abha Sur, who works in MIT, wrote a piece about her in Meridians, which I think was published either in the late 90s or early 2000s. I don't remember exactly now. And only when I read that did I hear about this lady. And I moved to Trivandrum around the same period, and Anna had already moved here. She was very unwell. And Anna's sister who was looking after her knew my mother. So there was communication between the two. And so I knew that there was this scientist who was here, but I didn't know anything more. And what made me write this book, it's a long time, almost 20. It took me a long time to even decide. I wasn't planning to write a biography or anything about anyone. So, but then I was working with the Alliance Française here, and we were doing some science communication workshops. This is 2014, 2015, that period. And in one of them on women in science, I asked the young children, can you name a woman in science? And there was just silence. And then one hand went up and said, Marie Curie. So I said, yes, there is a problem here and one needs to solve that problem. So that's how I thought of, okay, maybe I'll write a book. And then I, thought of a couple of people, and the other book is still in the process, but this one got done. So it took me a long time to get it done, but that's how I got into it.
Now, of course, I think your book, more than anything else, it does a really tremendous job of conveying to the readers the enormity and the breadth of Anna's contributions to meteorology, to space science, and how her work so firmly put India on the global map when it came to international efforts of to improve our measurement of weather and our weather data collection. Now, without getting into the details of each of her contributions, which I think readers can easily read your book and find out about, I want to ask you to sort of summarize what you think is the legacy that Anna leaves behind, or maybe I should say left behind, because from what I understand in your book, it does seem like since Anna passed away in the early 2000s, meteorology in India has shifted focus and it's going in a little bit of a different direction in the past 2 decades. So can you comment about basically what was Anna's biggest contribution?
That's a hard question to answer, Nandita, because I don't know whether there was any one contribution that was more notable than the other. But I think one thing that's important to understand is that Anna actually did her PhD with C.V. Raman, and she worked on, the Raman using Raman spectroscopy to study the luminescence of diamonds and rubies and so on and so forth. And this move to meteorology was actually purely by accident, because the only postdoc fellowship that was available was the meteorological instrumentation in the UK. So she took it thinking that, this will make a contribution to the country. This was 1945, before India became independent, and all these students who were students in Indian Institute of Science really wanted India to become independent, and they wanted to contribute in some way. I mean, obviously they were all in labs and working very hard to publish papers, but they did want to contribute. And this was Anna's way of thinking that maybe I can do something for the country. So she goes and she gets trained properly, and she comes back and gets a job in the IMD Pune. And from then she, it is not just Anna, it was her mentor also, SPV, S.P. Venkateshwaran, who started working there much before her, who started laying the foundation of the workshops there, which were absolutely so wonderful that private sector companies from Bombay would come and use their workshops. He modernized it and everything. And so in India till then, all the instrumentation that we had was imported from Britain. And all their little workshop did till then was to repair things. We did not make anything of our own. So when Anna came in, she started redoing everything. And she says somewhere that, it was only after coming to India, even though I got trained in the best places in the UK, it's only after coming to India and actually working here that I really learned what it meant to work at the ground. And so even now, if you go to IMD Pune, you'll see lots of drawings and sketches. I don't know whether they are made by her or by some, person who's, engaged to do that sort of thing. But about the instruments that they initially started. So they initially started by copying designs. Then they modified those designs. And finally, they just broke off and started making their own things. So in every field that she did, and she wasn't just maker of instruments, she was also a physicist. She was using these to study physics, to do physics. And that's very important to understand. People often, dismiss her and, undermine her contributions by saying, here was this weather woman of India or something like that. But she was studying atmospheric physics and doing several things that could be done under local conditions. For instance, using radar to study certain aspects of the atmosphere in Pune. They would go to a fort or they'll go here or there. And so many of our papers at that period have to do with that. So atmospheric electricity, ozone. Her contribution to the study of ozone is so immense that she got the first K.R. Ramanathan Memorial Award for that, medal for that. Mm-hmm. And it was during her student and her junior colleague Sridharan who actually finally made the ozone sonde, which nobody else could make, which studies atmospheric ozone. So then her contributions are immense. And then after retirement, she goes on to work in wind energy and solar energy in a big way, including making instruments for that in Bangalore. So I can't pin down and say this is Anna's legacy. But one thing I can say that for her and for her generation, wanting to do science was wanting to do something more for the country. It was beyond just publishing papers. They were publishing papers and they were attending conferences, but they also wanted to do something more than that. For instance, there was a airline crash in Delhi, and she dragged somebody there so that they could, do something. So next time the instrumentation, the landing instrumentations and, whatever at the airport would be improved so that there wouldn't be another crash. Now, how many scientists do we know today who would do that, who get out of their lab and go out and say, hey, even the atmospheric pollution or whatever, how many of them actually unless it falls under their project guidelines, they don't bother. But that wasn't the case. And I think that certainly is what stands out for me about her and her generation of people, I think.
And also, I found it really interesting, your comments in the book about Indian meteorology today and how the focus is no longer on, in-house, homemade instruments, but we seem a lot more comfortable using instruments from outside. Can you just tell me your reading of how things have changed today? I don't know if it's for the better or for the worse, but you do comment on these things. Can you tell us once again?
Yeah, when I was writing about all these, because I'm not a, meteorologist at all. So I had to go and see each one of these things and understand what radiosonde was or an ozone sonde was or what these measurements, when I actually saw all these. So wherever I went, for instance, the radiosonde measurements I saw in Trivandrum itself. I saw that the instruments they were using were certainly not homemade or Indian made. They were using Korean and, Japanese or German or Chinese. And this really surprised me because the emphasis was so much on make your own and fly your own and even sell your own. They were selling ozone sondes to other countries. So there was all that, and now there's so much talk about Make in India, and we can start up India and this, that, and the other. But at least from what I saw, that is not the emphasis. And so this actually, I checked with one of her colleagues, her former colleagues, Dr. G.P. Srivastava, who lives in USA now, and quite elderly. So I asked him, I mentioned this to him, and he said that's because the structure of IMD has changed. It's now more like a CSIR institution with scientists who are graded from, scientist B to scientist G. And the promotion happens because they publish a lot of papers or attend conferences or whatever, just like other institutions. So nobody has the time to spend, 1 or 2 years making an instrument and perfecting it, maybe getting one paper out of it. So that has fallen, that is gone. And also probably, I don't know, but maybe there are lobbies from these other countries coming in to lobby people to buy their stuff. And maybe it's not important anymore. The other thing that struck me also was earlier ozone readings used to happen throughout the country. There were many centers where ozone sondes were being sent. Today, only in Delhi, in Ayanagar, every 15 days an ozone sonde is being sent for ozone measurements. And I was wondering why that is the case, why they have reduced the number of ozone readings. Is it because they don't feel the need for it? Or is there some other reason? I wouldn't be able to answer this question, but somebody in IMD should be able to answer it. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Dr. G.P. Srivastava, and so I did want to move to the parts of the book which I think that for many readers, if not most, some of the most interesting parts of the book will be the ones where we get glimpses into Anna's personality. And I know this wasn't easy for you to accomplish because, as you write in your introduction, our country has a very poor tradition of archiving, especially when it comes to women in science. But I did feel that in many ways, it seems like someone of Anna Mani's stature surely must have tons of material preserved, you would think, especially considering how much and how well she wrote, how much she loved. She was an avid photographer, as you wrote, and she also seemed to generally, compared to many of us, do a pretty good job at documenting her own life. And can you just elaborate on why it was still so hard for you as a biographer to find out more about this aspect of the book?
When I started off, all I had was her scientific papers, which I read. And I also had 2 interviews. One she gave to Abha Sur, that Abha published both in Meridians as well as a chapter in her book, Dispersed Radiance. And then the other one that she's given to Hessam Taba of the Bulletin, WMO Bulletin. So these are the 2 things that I had. I didn't have anything more to go with. And probably because I'm also not a so-called quote-unquote trained biographer, I also initially did not know where to look. So I went to Raman Research Institute, which really helped me a lot. And there are a lot of papers there, but it's not an archive, so to speak. So they will go through big cardboard boxes and suddenly they'll come out with something and ask me whether I wanted it. And of course I wanted it. And that's how we progressed. And then Anna's flat in Bangalore, that's another place I visited, and where many of her letters are there. So then I started getting all this information that, the letters started falling into place. And then I think the book started getting a more human quality to it, because you could see what she was saying, and you could see what others were saying to her. And then, those are the sort of details that many of us are interested in, actually, not just purely science. So I started editing those things into several chapters, so that I felt that if I have a readership that is not just scientists, but also, anybody, even if they're getting a little bit tired with the science, they can go into the other aspects and enjoy the book.
And that said, one of the most poignant and telling chapters of your book for me was the one that you chose to tell through the voice of Anna herself. And this is the series of letters that she had written to her student, G.P. Srivastava. So tell me about how you stumbled upon these letters, and what did they add to your own understanding of Anna, where, in that process of trying to figure her out and understand her and write about her?
one GP Srivastava, Dr. GP Srivastava wasn't her student. Actually, he was a colleague, junior colleague. And I stumbled upon it because Raman Research Institute suddenly stumbled upon it in their in one of their cardboard boxes and asked me whether I wanted it. And I said, of course I want it. And so they Xeroxed the whole thing and sent it to me here. And then when I started reading, it was such an eye opener. And I said, boy, this made it. This made the book. This will make the book will click because of this. And so I decided that I will just put excerpts from those letters make it into one chapter, Anna in her own words. And what it told me is, here's this woman who was, of course, those letters span from the 60s, I think, all the way up to the 90s when she couldn't write anymore. And it tells me about a woman who was living during her time, very observant of what was going on around her at that period, very meticulous about how her department was running, even when she was not there, and she got regular reports from her. And those days they couldn't send emails or, WhatsApp or anything. They were just writing letters to each other. So in a way, it's good for a biographer. It's good because you get these letters. Whereas I don't know what any contemporary biographer would do with email and WhatsApp. These things don't remain, no? So at least one had all that. So her travels, things she observed during her travels, when she was in Leningrad or wherever, and she talks about how open the Russians were to them, and they were treated like kings, and given lots of gifts, and all those things were very interesting. And then when she went to Egypt, for instance, of course, Dr. G.P. Srivastava and some other colleagues of hers had already been there. So they gave her some pointers as to where to stay, what to do. And eventually she moves into her own house. I mean, one of them had vacated that house and she moves in there. But the maid, she came and a day before and cleaned everything away. So there's this very funny thing where she writes about how I can't remember the name of the woman, but she has come and she's cleaned and not even a little bit of soap is left. So I had to go out and buy everything, So there are a lot of little things about her that make her very human. That's the sort of thing I would, do. If I go somewhere and I can't find anything and someone's run away with all this, and I would certainly comment about it. So you see this famous scientist seeing those things. So that's and her concern for her colleagues. People, when I started writing the book and I started meeting many people, especially in Delhi, everybody would say, oh, Anna Mani, oh God, the terror, the impression they conveyed was that she was a real terror. But when I read her letters, and when I read the things that many people who actually knew her very well tell me, I don't feel that she ever was a terrorist. And what Dr. Deshikan, who passed away, unfortunately, another one of her colleagues who worked with her on radiation, what he said is that she could be a terror to people who wouldn't finish things on time, who wouldn't work, who would be slack, because she was very meticulous. But for other people, it wasn't that. She was very concerned. She was very caring as a director of that unit. And for instance, even when she went to Delhi, she wouldn't let the workers from Pune come to Delhi during the winter season because they didn't have winter vardi. She knew it was very cold and they didn't have clothes for that. So now these are not things that everybody thinks about. Yeah. So, one striking thing which I'll say, and I'll stop here about this question, is this episode with C. Radhakrishnan. He's a very well-known Malayalam writer. And C. Radhakrishnan actually is trained in physics and got a job in Kodaikanal and in one of the IMD centers. And I think he was doing seismology there. Can't remember what he was doing. But anyway, he was writing on the side because he was a writer. He was writing on the side. Now, the people in Kodaikanal didn't like that at all. So he got a huge file against him. And then they finally decided this is not going to work. Let us send him to Pune where the tigress resides. So he was promptly transferred to Pune. And this big file appeared on Anna's desk. So she called him and said, hey, what have you done to, get such a big file? So, he must have said, I write these books. So she should bring them to me. And she could read Malayalam also. So she read the books and then she wrote on the file, let him continue writing. Not many people will do that. They will just follow the narrow, straight path. And she was, and after he leaves, and then he leaves IMD eventually. But when she writes this book called Spandanangale Nanni, in Malayalam, that's what it's called. It's his life in IMD. It's fictionalized account. Whereas she is also there. She helped him get it translated into English because she felt the translation he had done himself wasn't that good. So till the end of her life, she kept in touch with this person and he kept in touch with her. So I think this tells you a lot about the person, and it really told me a lot about who she was as a person. Yeah.
It is also, it makes me think about some of the letters she wrote which you don't really see from a lot of, boss figures, where after they're hard on you, having the humility to, kind of, I don't think she apologized, but there were many, many letters where she expressed that she felt bad about being hard on somebody, and that was, I think, really a very precious thing to have in a boss figure. And often you hear this of, even people like Rosalind Franklin is supposed to have been, not a people's person and made many enemies, so to speak, within her academic and professional circle. So it does make you think about, if you actually could hear from them, then you might see the side to them that you would not have if you just rely on people's opinions of them. So that way, I think this chapter, I'm so glad it's there in the book to balance many of the other perspectives that we see. So I know that we don't have a lot of time and I have a lot of questions, but I also, being a science communicator myself, I wanted to ask you how you decided how much in depth you wanted to go into the science that Anna Mani did, and you have gone very much. You've not taken any shortcuts with the science part of the book with her contributions, and I think maybe, if not all, at least most of her papers, you've actually taken the trouble to put a chronology to it and to sort of storytell this in, I think, the best that you could. I imagine this would have not been easy to do. And I don't know if you had any internal battles about, okay, am I pushing some readers away at this point? Should I stop here? Should I go more into detail? Because of course, Anna, above everything else, she was a researcher, and you don't want to downplay that. So what were the steps you took to sort of make sure that you're not going to lose your reader while doing this?
Like I said, I only had access to her papers to begin with. So I read all of them. I actually read all of them, and I took copious notes. And then I went through it, and each chapter that I was writing, that's why many of the chapters start, they say ozone or radiation or things like that. That's the reason, because then I clubbed some of these papers together and I started writing. And yes, it was at the back of my mind, too much of it, will it put off the reader? And am I conveying what I want to convey properly? And after I wrote 5 chapters, and that time it was actually not like as they are today. I gave it to 5 young people to read, and I gave them 10 questions and asked them to respond, which they did very honestly. There were 3 women and 2 young men. And out of that, I think 2 were doing their PhD. 1 was in BSSC, and 1 had just gone to do a master's in computer science in the UK and USA. And there was a young boy who was in class 12 then. And they gave me very honest answers, especially the youngest one. And because I think his father, who worked in a bank, also tried to read it. And the father couldn't understand anything. So he wrote a comment saying, maybe for physics students it's okay, but for no chance that anybody else will understand it. These were his words. So, and somebody else said, you're talking about so many instruments, it's all becoming a big muddle in our head. So I had to do a lot of rewriting. And by then I started getting these interesting, anecdotes about her life also. So that started, when I started rewriting is when I started getting all these other things also. So then I started, I didn't want to change the structure of the book because it was already there. So I started editing in other things into various chapters as and when I got it, and where I felt it would be relevant if I mentioned it, and to make it more interesting. But to be very honest, I was working in so much isolation here after that I did not give it to anyone to read. So only after the first reviews started coming in, and they're rather good. And they're done by journalists. Actually, my first set of reviews are all done by journalists, and they are not scientists. And they seem to have enjoyed the book. So then I thought, okay, so something seems to have worked. And when someone says, this part gets too much, I said, leave that part and go on. Don't read the part that is, too much for you. Just go on. And recently I was at the book fair looking at various biographies, scientific types. And what I notice is what many of the trade publishers do is that they remove all the science from there. There isn't a single plot. There isn't a single diagram. There isn't anything. Somehow the science is just obscured. So how can you write about a scientist without having the science in it? And that's important to me. And that way I have to give credit to NBT that they do not edit any of that out. They left it the way I wanted it to.
The most striking quote attributed to Anna Mani for me is the one thing that I read in Abha Sur's book, Dispersed Radiance. And Anna said to have been surprised when Abha expressed interest in interviewing her. And she said something like, what is this hoopla about women and science? It must be hard. It must be getting difficult for women to do science these days. We had no such problems in our time. This struck me because while Anna was no doubt privileged in a lot of fundamental ways, she certainly did face gender-based obstacles, both explicit, as in the case of C.V. Raman's treatment of women in his lab, and also implicit, and of which I think examples are numerous in your book when you read through her letters and her experiences. So having now engaged so deeply with her as a person, I'm curious to know how you interpret this hoopla statement.
Well, I think Anna had, I only know Anna by writing about her. I've never met her or anything of that sort. But I have a feeling, and this is something I wish I could have in my life, she had a way of ignoring most of the troubles that came her way and just focusing on what she wanted out of her, wanted to do. So she wouldn't sit there pining and moaning about lots of things, which she could have actually, because right from her doctoral days, there were issues, gender issues. And which I think that to some extent she must have known that these were gender issues. But the thing is, it wasn't articulated in those terms. It's only in 1975 that in India, gender becomes women, as they used to say in those days. It's only women. It's gender. The word gender starts getting used much later. That comes into discussion, after the International Women's Year in 1975. So, and the women's movement after emergency, the second wave, the women's movement, and so on and so forth. So, so Anna, when she was working, that wasn't the case in public discourse. It was more the nationalist movement. So, women should be part of the nationalist movement or, get into. But even so, the facts show that when Anna was, going all around the world doing this fantastic stuff in IMD, other women at IMD were either at the maximum they went up to is senior observer level, observer or senior observer, or clerical posts. There were no women in the scientific staff in IMD who, certainly no one at her level, no one who rose to her level. So this, I'm sure she saw that. But probably, as I say, when certain questions are not being asked around you, probably she did not think about it. But then she did begin to reflect. After Abha said this, she began to reflect and she started to think whether she could have improved conditions for the women who worked, around her. She did. I think I read it or Abha told me or something. She did reflect on it. So it's not that she wasn't reflective about it. But then Abha is talking to her in the 90s, so there's a big difference already. So the thing is, which period are we talking about? And Anna and her friends, her friend, I am quoting this lady, Violet Bajaj. Violet also did very well. She was a scientist working somewhere. And so Violet was doing well. She has other friends who were scientists, so that is probably why Saroj that she talks about. I think she was running a botanical park or something in Pune. So, so there are people around her, there were women scientists who were doing various things. So maybe that is the reason why she did not see, this happening at the lower levels. Yeah.
So if there's one event or maybe a non-event in Anna's life that exemplifies that she was handed the shorter end of the stick from Indian academia and science, it is the fact that she was refused a PhD despite doing all the work that would go towards one while she was working in C.V. Raman's lab at IISc. And there are a number of technical reasons attributed to this. And Anna herself it seems rarely complained openly about it. But I came out of your book totally compelled by your argument that ISC must correct this and award her and Sunanda Bai a posthumous PhD. Why do you think this matters, and do you think it could actually happen?
Well, first part of the question is, see, both Sunanda Bai and Anna Mani did all the work that was required for their thesis. Sunanda Bai published 10 papers, single author papers. They were all publishing in this Indian Academy of Science journals. It has just been started by Raman, and that's where all his students published. And Anna published 6, out of which 1 is the Ruby, work on Ruby, and the rest 5 are her work on Diamond. And I have visited the library in the Institute of Science, and Anna's Ruby work is submitted as a master's thesis, and her the Diamond work is submitted as a PhD thesis. Sunanda Bai's work is entirely submitted as her PhD thesis. And Sunanda Bai had come to IIC with already a master's from Banaras Hindu University. So the argument that's floating around is Anna didn't have a master's. Now that's not true, because she did a BSc honors. And BSc honors was meant for very high level students. And that actually, the way they structured it, etc., was such that they were given a titular master's within 2 years of receiving this BSc degree. K.R. Ramanathan got it. So the question remains, why didn't Madras University give Anna that degree? Number 1. Number 2, she had already submitted her Ruby work as a master's to the university. Why wasn't that considered enough to be? So I don't believe this master's argument at all. I think it had to do with something entirely different, and a variety of things, probably bureaucracy there or a whole bunch of things. But the question that came to my mind is, here the 2 women who worked in Raman's lab, and Sunanda Bai, he supervised himself. So why is it that he didn't, remove these obstacles? He could have done that quite easily, because he was one of the most powerful physicists in the whole world then. He didn't do that. And Anna, it didn't affect her career. And that I think has to do with the fact that it was that period. It was that time period. If this had happened today, you couldn't continue in your career after that, because some clerk sitting in some office will say, "Kahan hai aapki PhD? Nahi hai." I say, "Chalo." Finished. Nobody. It had to do with that. It also had to do with it. She did come out of the Raman lab, and she had all these publications. So she got a postdoc, and then life moved on. And then she also didn't work in academia. She worked in IMD. There's that difference also, because many of the people who came into IMD in those days didn't have PhDs. They came in there, they worked, and then Anna insisted that they get their PhDs. So Dr. Sridharan got his PhD for making the ozone sound. Dr. G.P. Srivastava did lots of work, and she insisted that he should submit it and he's got a fantastic book actually, and get his PhD. So he also got his PhD. So that is the thing. Now, whether the Indian Institute of Science, yes, those days the degrees were granted by Madras University. Today it's granted by IIC itself. And I feel it's important to correct a wrong. This is a wrong. Why this was, and Raman was very impressed with the work that Anna had done in his lab. Later on, he goes and looks at it, and he's like totally impressed. And he's very impressed with the work she's doing after leaving his lab also. So this question arises, and I believe that the Institute of Science should rectify this, whatever this mistake was, they should rectify it, and they can do it. And there's a historical, it's been done before in England, not here, when these women who went to study medicine, I think it is in the 1870s or later, I don't know, in Scotland, and they were not even allowed to go into classes those days, but they were never awarded their degrees, these medical students. And finally, 150 years later, some years ago, they were given their degrees as a mark of atonement to something wrong that had happened 150 years ago. So similar to that, I think something should happen. And that's a message that the Indian Institute of Science would be sending out, saying that, they are willing to be open about correcting a wrong. And I do believe that this is a wrong.
I think it would be quite a powerful message that, she was known as Miss Mani most professional life. If we could make that a Dr. Mani, I think that would.
Many people do use doctor or professor or whatever, but it is unfortunate that had to happen all her life. Yeah.
Really. So we're, I think, out of time, and we don't want to extend this too much, but I think what we've spoken about today, your really thoughtful and candid and detailed answers to my questions will hopefully encourage listeners to pick up the book and give themselves a chance to get acquainted with this very thoroughly fascinating and brilliant figure, maybe hidden figure in Indian science. So thanks, Asha, for this conversation, and thank you, Frontline, for platforming this.
Thanks so much, Nandita, and thanks, Frontline. And one suggestion I have is with the book, please consult the website. We have created a website that goes along with the book. And so that gives you much more information than what we could put in the book. So I suggest that those who buy the book also take a look at the website. Thanks so much. And I hope more people will buy the book and read it, and people will know about Anna.